Hello and welcome to the New Orchard. War is hell, they say, but there is no bigger hell than the trenches of World War I. Called the Great War for a reason, it was the largest and by far the most destructive conflict the world has experienced up to that point. The incredible scale of mobilization, the insane number of military and civilian casualties, and the global reach of the war were unprecedented. Labeling the conflict the Great War reflected a general belief that this war would be so impactful and so transformative that it surely be the last major conflict of its kind. To illustrate the madness of World War I, let me offer some basic statistics. Total estimated death toll equals 16 million people, approximately 10 million military deaths, and between 6 and 7 million civilian deaths. Total military casualties, this includes dead, wounded and missing, is estimated at 37 million people. Many soldiers were wounded multiple times and cycled back to the trenches. In some battles, casualty rates exceeded 50% of all troops involved. The Battle of the Somme alone recorded 1.2 million casualties, which included 57,000 British casualties on the first day of the battle, 1st of July 1916. Still, the worst day in British military history. Artillery caused approximately 70% of all combat deaths, far more than rifles and bayonets. Industrial-scale shelling reshaped landscapes and left a huge number of soldiers with so-called shell shock, which essentially is what we today call PTSD. A total of 1.5 billion shells were used in the conflict, which, as mentioned, transformed vast areas of France and Belgium into lifeless dystopian moonscapes. Some of those areas, surprisingly, are still uninhabitable due to all kinds of contamination and unexploded ordnance. Chemical weapons introduced in 1915 and used over 50,000 times caused no less than 1 million casualties and approximately 90,000 deaths. One of the saddest facts from the war is that soldiers as young as 12 took part in the hellish trench warfare. Minimum enlistment age at the time of the conflict was 18, but boys as young as 12 and 13 lied about their age, wanting to fight for their country. In the UK alone, approximately 250,000 underage boys are believed to have enlisted. The war ended in 1918, but its political fallout, including the famous Treaty of Versailles, laid the groundwork for World War II just 21 years later. Some historians argue that World War I did not truly end until the conclusion of World War II in 1945. Others, like my guest today, argue that the fallout in one form or another continues to this day. A couple of months ago, a book by Frank Furedi titled First World War, Still No End in Sight landed in my lap. The author contends in the book that World War I was not merely a military conflict, but a profoundly unique cultural and ideological rupture. Professor Furedi suggests that the conflict catalyzed a transformation in societal values, which then led to a persistent state of cultural conflict that manifests today as the culture wars. He claims that the ideological battles that began in 1914 have evolved and remain largely unresolved, continuing to polarize and influencing debates over identity, morality, and societal norms. It's a fascinating piece of research and writing, which helped me to better understand some of the cultural trends that have permeated the West over the last few decades. And this is the reason why I wanted to interview Professor Frank Furedi and ask him a few questions that have crystallized in my mind after I finished reading First World War, Still No End in Sight. My guest today, Professor Frank Furedi, is an emeritus professor of sociology at the University of Kent. He completed his PhD in research and Masters in African Politics at the School of Oriental and African Studies. He completed his BA in Political Science at McGill University. He's a sociologist, social commentator, and an author of over 20 books, which include Democracy Under Siege, The War Against the Past, Why the West Must Fight for Its History, How Fear Works, Culture of Fear in the 21st Century, Paranoid Parenting, and many, many more. There's a lot of ground I want to cover in this interview today, so let's just dive in. Alright, Professor, let's start with this. You argue in the book that the ideological conflicts sparked by World War I still shape our world today. Was there a particular moment or event that convinced you that this was the case and prompted you to write this book?
I think that I felt that the issues that were raised in the First World War were never actually resolved in a kind of a long term sense. It might be the case that one side wins the military conflict, other side loses, but the way in which the balance of power existed both internally within nations and also externally meant that the war would just simply continue. And I felt that if you took a long term view of things, everybody knows that the Second World War is the continuation of the First World War. That's nothing new. But what I also argued was that in many ways, what we call the culture wars directly comes about as a result of the conflicts that kicked in the First World War. And I think in many ways, the cultural conflict that is still very strong and very prominent in many parts, well, all parts of the Western world, is something that has got a long way to go before it begins to get resolved. And I kind of, when I realized that actually the cultural dimensions were more important than the communist, fascist, and various other ideological conflicts of the interwar period, that's really why I decided to write the book. I just figured I should go back and retrace my steps.
The angle that you've picked for the book is quite original because many history books normally focus on political and military events, but you highlight cultural and ideological shifts instead. What blind spots do mainstream historical narrative have about World War One, and what do they miss in terms of its long-term effects?
Well, I think that they imagine that the war just simply ends when peace treaties are signed, or alternatively, they think that you have maybe a continuation, another conflict, but that will get resolved. So, if you remember, by the time we get to the end of the Cold War, everybody is 100% certain that this is the end of history, that this is the end of all these different types of conflicts that occurred. People begin to make speeches about the fact that we now live in an era of peace, at least in Europe, and there's never going to be any more wars again. So you have a blind spot about the fact that what the First World War did was to unravel the self consciousness, the confidence of the ruling elites in their own culture and their own way of life. They basically didn't really understand that once you have this disassociation from your historical past, and you no longer know what is right and what is wrong, and certainly you're not very sure about how to transmit what you may think is right and wrong, you're going to have all kinds of problems. And I kind of see the cultural dynamic is already kicking in much earlier than it was recognized. But you have to remember that even today in the 21st century, there are a lot of people that argue, oh, we exaggerate the importance of the culture war. They will say, Frank, why do you talk about the culture war when the economic conflict is more important? Or they will say, well, we're not coming to the end of woke, or this is not coming to an end. And when you look at the number of times that they've declared the end of of cultural conflict from the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, they still haven't learned that these are very durable issues that are deeply seated in our psyche, and we have to be able to understand, at least come to terms with them, acknowledge them before we can do very much more about them.
Your book suggests that historical memory of World War One has been repurposed for contemporary political agendas. Can you give an example of how modern politicians or movements have distorted the war's meaning for their own ends?
I think there's a very strong tendency to read history backwards and to transpose to the past their own preoccupations, and therefore what you've got is our complaints about the fact that we don't acknowledge the role of animals and horses in the war, and that we should, almost like set up memorials for them, or alternatively, uh, it's basically the war is seen entirely as this dehumanizing, destructive, barbaric conflict, and we overlook the fact that for a lot of people, the war was existentially a very important experience, and it was something that people actually wanted to get involved in, not because they were necessarily extremely nationalistic in the way that it's often seen, but just because you're living in a world where you work in an office and you basically marking time, and life has got very limited opportunities for expressing yourself. And suddenly, you find yourself in the barracks with these other people, and the kind of quality of relationships that you forge, the intimacy, is really something special. So the war actually has got to be understood in terms of the experience of people living in 1914 rather than in in the contemporary era. And people continually want to sort of rediscover themselves, rediscover their problems in the past. And I think that's what's really has happened. And in particular, I think what's very interesting, certainly if you're living in Britain, is the way that Britain's role is continually sort of problematized. The way that Britain is, kind of seen, and the role of Britain and British patriotism is devalued, and the way in which everything that Britain did is seen automatically as harmful and something to be avoided. It turns into a story of shame as far as Britain is concerned, including the contributions that all those people made in the course of the war. So there's a kind of anti-patriotic, anti-national sentiment that's continually used to sort of reinterpret the war in an extremely negative, one-sided light.
What do you attribute that to? Is it cowardice of our leaders being afraid to speak up and uphold truth? What is happening there?
Well, I think for a variety of reasons, our culture has become totally estranged from the value of patriotism. We think that patriotism is something that only idiots feel or experienced. We live in a world where we think that Britain's national story has got to be continually deconstructed and criticized and turned into a story of shame. We kind of find that every time somebody flies the flag or wants to remember a particular historical event, that's seen as somehow not seem just nostalgic, but kind of extremely primitive and backward. And what has happened is that uh, the way in which, in the past, people used to glorify British history in a very one-sided way, and therefore not really taking into account some of the problems and the blemishes and the errors and the tragedies that occurred. Today we have the opposite tendency of not glorifying, but continually subverting and continually demonizing what has happened in the past in the same kind of one-sided way. And I think that's particularly a problem, because what it means is that any young kid growing up in Britain today hasn't got anything to be proud of. There's no sense of continuity that that young person is encouraged to kind of cultivate. And what we do is we leave young people with nothing in terms of the legacy of the past. And no wonder that so many of them suffer from a variety of different identity crises.
Indeed, I couldn't agree more with you. Can I ask you, as you work at the university, and there's definitely some level of awareness in public consciousness that points the finger at the university system, not just in the UK, but all over the West, really, and accuses that system of subverting the very value system you have just talked about. What's your point of view on this?
I think universities played an important role as being a laboratory where some of these ideas are crystallized. But I think that in the first instance, what's logically prior to the university is the detachment of the British political establishment, cultural establishment, from its own historical legacy. The way in which, at a certain point, and I discussed that in the book, already in the interwar period, people begin to develop a very pessimistic account of what it means to be British. And there's a growing reluctance to defend the kind of values that they and their ancestors were socialized into. So once you have a situation where the people that are meant to be guiding society are not really guiding society in accordance with what that society was historically about, therefore, it's not surprising that the universities acquired a disproportionate role in the socializing of young people and society. And universities, of course, did play that kind of a role. But then, of course, you know, if there had been a strong political establishment, cultural establishment, they could have resisted the university's attempt to subvert the past. But instead of resisting it, they just took it on board, internalized it, and made it their own.
That's very interesting. Let's jump into the next question in the sequence and talk about tactics and the conduct of war. Much has been made of the trench warfare stagnation of World War I, but To what extent was it a failure of imagination rather than a necessity of technology? Were there missed tactical revolutions that could have changed the course of the war?
I don't know. It's very difficult to imagine yourself in that situation, and especially because we now live in an era where warfare is continually changing. It's kind of continually being revolutionized by new technology. But you have to remember that despite the fact that there was a lot of marking time and a lot of stagnation in the trenches, there were a number of very important innovations that occurred in the war. Just for example, the way that gradually horse warfare is gradually displaced by infantry and mechanized warfare. The introduction of tanks, the attempt to begin to use airplanes, albeit in a very limited kind of a way. They all indicated there was an attempt to continue to look at technology and I think and communication systems as well that were gradually being developed at that particular time. But I think the First World War is very much a transitionary period where you're moving away from wars that are essentially being fought by highly professional, sort of armies who are, with career officers and career soldiers being almost entirely in the forefront, to ones where you're essentially recruiting either willing or unwilling people to join your army. And there were, there were a lot of unwilling people fighting in that war on all sides, which then creates a very different number of tactical challenges as to how you organize them and how you motivate them and how you create that kind of l'esprit de corps. So I think in many ways this is a transitional period which gradually uh, created a much more innovative approach towards warfare afterwards, when, of course, as you know, the Second World War doesn't resemble the First World War anymore. It becomes very, very different.
The First World War saw the birth of modern propaganda and mass psychological warfare. How did this affect not only the wartime morale, but also post war societal attitudes and political structures?
That I'm not sure about as well, because although this was a point at which mass propaganda and attempts at psychological warfare were initiated, I'm not yet sure as to what extent it had as big an impact as it would have a little bit later on. I think that the main focus of war propaganda in the First World War was very much about cohering the nation together, cohering the army and support for the army into an effective force. I think that's really what it was trying to do. I think the propaganda against your opponents was still in a very early stage, albeit we have some very interesting, striking examples. The way the Brits tried to um, almost kind of demonize the Germans in relation to the raping of Belgian nuns and various other kind of stories that were kind of created. Um, I think that these were played a role, but uh, it was very early days at that point in time, and some of the things that would prove to be important, such as realizing the importance of the psychological traumatic effect of warfare on your soldiers, which already was, there was a knowledge about it before the First World War. Took a bit of time to sink in and to become a focus for medical specialization and medical intervention.
Do you think the rapid development of military technology during World War One created a kind of a permanent arms race mentality which continues to drive military industrial policies today?
Two things I would learn from the experience of First World War. One is the importance of military technology and military innovation, which was important not just for promoting an arm race, but also for encouraging economic development in general. And because many of these technologies were multi-purpose technologies kind of later on, and vice versa, many of the innovations in civilian industries proved to be really important for 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 military technology. So you had that a bit as being very important. Um, and very significant. But also, we kind of then realized that what's also important is the role of science and the role of technological innovation in general as an independent factor. The one thing that the conclusion that I've drawn is that what was really important in the long run wasn't just simply the innovation of new technologies, but the capacity to produce them. Because what you have is a twofold problem: procuring the necessary input and then producing these weapons. And we have some very good examples. The swiftness with which, for example, the United States managed to rearm. I think that's a textbook example, which I don't think could happen now. I don't think that we could do that now, not because of the lack of technology, but because we just haven't got the leadership and the will. And I think one of the things that when you look back upon, you realize that fortunately in the United States and in Britain to some extent, there was the kind of leadership that could make things, deliver things, make things happen. When I look at the people that are running British society today, when we're talking about rearming and raising defense expenditure, I ask the question: these are people that never built anything. These are people that cannot even build a railway. These are people that have hardly built anything in their lives. They just talk, 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 talk all the time. And that's the case everywhere in Europe. I think Britain, it isn't just in Britain that you have an incompetent political elite, but everywhere in Europe, it almost seems to be the case that nothing much gets done. And when you think of the innovation that has occurred in the Ukraine war, and this, on the force of necessity, and the kind of decisive leadership of the Ukrainians compared to many other parts of the world, you realize that technology is only one element in the arms race. What's also important is the human factor, and I think that's really what I've learned as being important and what's obviously lacking today.
That's really interesting that you attribute this lack of ability to arm the nation or nations at pace to the quality of leadership, which does obviously make sense. But wasn't the administrative class also in charge of World War One?
This goes back to the very beginning of our discussion. The administrative class, in 1914, 1918, were much more together. They were very clear about what they were about. They were very clear about what it meant to be British. They were very clear about the fact that they had a mission and they had a duty and a sense of responsibility to carry that out. That was a complex of things that mixed together for them. Today, the administrative class is also administrative, but it's principally a bureaucratic class that's risk averse, responsibility averse, that's value free, that is entirely technocratically oriented, and is continually looking for technical solutions to what are political or moral problems. And therefore, when you look at an average guy running running the Foreign Office or any of the Ministry of Defense, these people that work, they're different kinds of people. They haven't got the same degree of authority, the same degree of competence, the experience of leadership, very important leadership here, that the guys had back in 1914. And that I think is very important to realize, because at the end of the day, if the people that run society have become unable to give meaning to their society and inspire and motivate and lead, then very little gets done.
Very little gets done indeed. In your book, you argue that World War One led to a crisis of meaning in Western civilization. Can we trace modern nihilism, postmodernism, or even the erosion of traditional institutions back to the trenches of 1914 to 1918?
I think a lot of this stuff you can. I think you had the situation where suddenly a lot of people, a lot of smart people drew the conclusion that everything that they believed in all these years before the war that kind of motivated them was illusory. They often overreacted to the point at which they became extremely pessimistic and even fatalistic. So, what's the point of doing things? And if you look at the way in which literature and art evolves in the aftermath of the First World War, it all expresses this kind of zeitgeist of disorientation, which is really, really powerful. This kind of estrangement from society, which then decides to leave its traditions behind, thinks it's useless. What's the point of kind of carrying on with that? And at the same time, I think plays a very important role in encouraging people to adopt a fairly kind of relativist epistemology, a sense of what is right, what is wrong, a kind of moral relativism, which then leads to has got a number of different sociological, philosophical expressions in the decades to come.
The war created a generation of disillusioned veterans, some of whom became key figures in radical political movements. Can we draw parallels between these veterans and today's alienated or radicalized political actors?
No, because these people, for better or worse, had a strong, coherent sense of the world. Many of them had a sense of the kind of world they wanted to build. They had a more kind of future-oriented approach towards life than is the case today, because the activists today, people, for example, the protest movements, tend to be very much stuck in the present, and it's very rare that they will project a different world into the future. So, at the moment, we're living in a world where ideological conceptions are very almost non-existent, and where you either have um, an emphasis on technocratic politics, or alternatively, you have an emphasis on staying where we are, just marking time, stasis, which is what environmental politics is really all about, of reproducing what exists, but not going beyond that. Or you all have identity politics, which is all about me, all about myself and how I express myself. But at the moment, we kind of lack, and the only movement that's moving in a different direction is the populist movement or different populist forces, but it's still at a very early stage. And what populist movements are trying to do is to find a greater role for the people, a greater role for for democratic decision making. But at the moment, they're still having that kind of forward-looking orientation that would have been the case for better or worse. Often, the wrong kind of politics and great distortions, but at least there was an attempt to go beyond the present in the interwar era.
The last century is often framed as a story of two world wars, but in your book you suggest that World War One set the ideological groundwork for World War Two. Do you think that World War Two would have happened if World War One had been fought differently, or ended in a less punitive manner for the Germans?
I don't think it would happen in that kind of a way. Um, I think the First World War guaranteed that there will be a Second World War. It actually intensified the problem of the prevailing balance of forces, and it created a situation where Germany, sort of would have to do something to find a place in the world, because it was punished so severely, and its potential was so much thwarted that it guarantees you that they would start or get involved in some kind of a conflict. So I think that in many ways the First World War and the Second World War should be seen as a package, or as a play with two acts in it that are actually closely connected. But it's a play that doesn't get resolved, because at the end of the war, there's still a lack of resolution to it after 1945. So you have to carry on the drama to this day. It's very difficult to uh, have any clarity about. There were still a lot of things that were unresolved, but I don't know what form that would have taken, because you still had a situation where Japan was still looking for a place in the world, and Japan felt a little bit unfairly treated and really resented what was happening. China was emerging. China was gradually moving towards becoming a major global player, albeit regional rather than international. So things were still pretty unstable. And of course, you also had the other factor, which is you had, on the one hand, Britain, the predominant power, in decline, and America, this new power, in ascendancy. So you had a situation which was, by definition, fluid, very fluid. And as you know, when you have a geopolitical situation which is so fluid, anything can happen.
In your book, you describe how the war has replaced these grand ideological struggles with cultural conflicts. How do you see this shift playing out in today's identity politics and general polarization?
A lot of people think that identity politics is driven by some kind of ideology. I don't. I think there's what we have is a situation where, in the absence of any kind of ideological coherence, we've moved towards an extremely inward-looking, what I see as a kind of therapeutically informed orientation towards the world, very fatalistic one, where for a lot of people, what matters is whether they're recognized, whether they're validated, and what really matters is that they and their group should be recognized as having suffered a lot of pain historically. And therefore, what you have is a situation where the focus of identity politics becomes almost like as much fixing the problems of the past than in dealing with the problems of the present. And that's why you have a situation where there's a continuous attempt to um, almost like live in the past and criticize the terrible things that were done to you and to your identity over the years. And that kind of backward looking focus where you try to rediscover yourself through settling scores of the past actually means that you become distracted from asking the questions, well, what are the next steps? Where are we going in the years ahead?
The dissolution of old empires after World War One was finished led to new nation states, many of which remain politically fragile. Are we still paying the price for the arbitrary redrawing of maps in a post-war period?
Well, I don't know exactly how to answer the question because obviously the new states, which are not so new now, that have kind of kicked in, uh, are essentially still the bearers of the legacy of the past. And most of them have, with some exceptions, have not yet been able to uh, develop the kind of cohesion and the kind of stability that a particular society needs to kind of move forwards. But having said that, there's been tremendous changes, even in Africa, which had the greatest amount of problems, which means that even though there's a tremendous artificiality about the borders that were drawn of these nation states, and nevertheless, with the passing of time, in some parts, you can see kind of progress being made. But obviously, this is going to be an area where rivalries between China, America in particular, but also other societies, are going to be very, very important. It's already happening in Latin America and in parts of Africa where China has really moved in to play a new kind of imperial role. And of course, America too has had to join in and make sure that its access to resources remains open. So we are seeing new kinds of conflict, not unlike the conflicts that kicked in the late 19th century, occurring in many many parts of these new of the world where these new states are located.
Is this what the current conflict between Russia and Ukraine is about? Access to vast natural resources? Or is there something much deeper there that's directly connected to World War One?
Well, the Russia-Ukraine war is directly linked to First World War. I mean, in terms of the borders that were kind of created and changed and then changed again. If you look at the series of conflicts that occurred, the way in which Ukraine was this plaything of different, occupied by a number of different nations, from Russia to Poland to even the Czechs, sort of. Uh, so that war is very much a continuation of that. But latterly, it's also been complicated by the fact that with America's involvement, the issue of mineral resources have also uh, become important. And I think that was not really what one expected at the beginning of the war. Maybe some people were already aware of that and knew about it, but it's something that certainly has become very important. And we can now see that there's a new phase of conflict and rivalry occurring over the mineral resources of the Ukraine, of the Arctic, the Antarctica, Greenland. All these places have acquired tremendous importance because of the demands of new technologies and new industries.
The First World War shattered faith in elites, institutions, and traditional authority, if you like. Given the recent global skepticism towards governments and experts, do you think we are seeing echoes of the same post war disillusionment today?
Well, I think that there's a difference between disillusionment about something that really motivated you and your parents. In other words, where you're reacting to this sense of wow, we live in the Belle Epoque. We live in a world where uh, things are going to get better, and we live in a very kind of nice and civilized world. And then you realize that the carpet has been pulled under your legs and your feet, and you react to that. There's a difference between that and a world where illusions were always conspicuously feeble. So it's not the case that the younger generations have lost their illusions. It's not the case that their parents have lost their illusions, because we've been fairly skeptical and fairly um, almost unmotivated by ideologies or values around us. So what we have really is a continuation of the same. And I think that the last moment when illusions, when these feelings kind of existed, was in the late 60s, early 70s. Since that point, we've become extremely knowingly, sort of, if not cynical, then low expectation in the way that we've kind of moved forward.
The Great War was widely seen as an inevitable war, yet hindsight often makes it look quite preventable. Do you think we are in danger of sleepwalking into another global conflict in a similar way today?
I think the First World War was fairly inevitable. I don't think it could have been stopped. I mean, by the time that people knew that these conflicts occurred, there were both domestic and international factors that were driving towards war. A lot of nations wanted war because they had very significant internal problems, and they felt that the war was the only way they could stabilize their society. Um, this was a situation where people were looking around. Well, how can we use foreign policy to gain a bit of authority? Right? So you had all these different elements, and then in addition to that, you then had the global conflicts, the geopolitical conflicts, all kind of, in a sense, interwoven and reinforcing one another. Today, a situation is very different in that at the moment there is manifestly fairly little appetite, internal appetite for war, as far as I can tell, at least in the West. It's not the case that people are saying, well, let's have a war to stabilize, because there is no serious internal opposition. It's not like there are mass movements that you had in before First World War in these societies. So there's no kind of domestic pressure in that direction. And secondly, you do have potential conflict, but it's almost that there's a kind of weariness and fatalism, which means that it's not like anybody actually wants a war, but it's possible that given their incompetence, they may well find themselves. If you begin to posture a lot against Russia and do this, that, and everything else, you might just provoke something inadvertently, and I think that's always a possibility. But at the moment, I don't think that uh, a global war is immediately on the agenda, and certainly not because of any kind of objective factors or political factors driving in that direction. It's almost as if the reason why you would have a conflict of a global on a global scale is because of a series of fairly significant miscalculations.
How would you explain this posturing of Keir Starmer towards Putin's Russia? Is this some kind of a smoke and mirrors show to distract the population from the government's inability to come up with any original ideas on how to make Britain strong and competitive on the global stage? I mean, what is this posturing? What is that?
Well, initially, what it was that a lot of Western European countries wanted to bask in the glory of Zelensky's moral authority. Here was Zelensky, who actually was appeared to be a leader. He seemed to have charisma. He was like what a leader looked like. So that's why they all went to Kiev to take photos with him. I mean, they all went there and they kept going back there for that reason. The optics was very important for them. And that's also why all these countries, without thinking about the long-term effects, signed up to various promises that we're going to help Ukraine do this, that, and everything else, uh, in a way that's actually quite unrealistic. And that kind of continues to this day. That promising God will do this, and we're going to be the group of the willing who's going to go there, and find. But I think there are a lot of that is a symptom of a political establishment that haven't thought through what needs to be done, what is in the interest of Britain or even in the Ukraine for that matter. And what we're seeing is a kind of very tired play being played out, which is going to lead to a lot of disappointments because in the end, Britain, like all the other countries, are most likely to leave Ukraine in the lurch when kind of push comes to shove. And when it comes to that point, you'll find very good reasons as to why not now.
All right, let's get back to your book. You write about the war's effect on ideas of heroism and masculinity. In an age where both concepts are increasingly contested, do you think the trauma of World War One played a role in shaping modern skepticism towards traditional virtues?
I think that the First World War did play a very important role in calling into question traditional virtues, particularly that of courage, sort of the kind of Aristotelian virtues. It kind of began to uh, move away from that. And even the sense of stoicism, which was always quite important as an integral element of ruling class consciousness, became weaker and weaker. But I think that what has happened is that what began as a reaction accelerated tremendously in the last few decades as masculinity itself has become stigmatized to the point at which the most frequent way we talk about masculinity is as toxic masculinity, not really seeing that manliness has got this certain positive attributes. I think that's to some extent linked to the fact that we lost commitment and faith in the possibility of retaining control over our lives, which is what men did. So yes, I think that there is a link, but the anti-man, anti-masculine sentiments and the anti-warrior sentiments that exist today are much more of a product of a society that has a very low expectation of what people can achieve. And instead of encouraging people to find courage to take risks, to take responsibility, it's got a very low, sort of undistinguished vision of what a human being is capable of.
If there was one lesson from World War One that we have completely failed to learn, what would it be?
That's a very good question. If there's one lesson that we've failed to learn from it, I think that the really important thing is that uh, conflict and wars are often very legitimate way of responding to the problems that you're kind of confronted with. But the really important thing to understand is we now know that wars never end tomorrow and they never end in the way that you expected. They always have a bad habit of carrying on for a very long time, and a very bad habit where it's very rare that in the modern era you have an unambiguous triumph and an unambiguous victory. There's always very important casualties on all sides. And I think for that reason, it is very important to basically take a step back and think about what a war is really all about and understand that this is a very dangerous and a very risky enterprise that you must only take in very special circumstances and thinking that through, being open to the idea that the war is going to have consequences that you don't expect and already begin to plan for that is really quite important.
One last question. How long did it take you to research and write this book, and how was the book received upon its release into the public sphere?
Well, I've been thinking about this problem for a while. I don't know how many years. The writing itself didn't take very long. I write very fast. It took me about a year to write it. But I'd already thought about the period. I was quite familiar with the era. I was always fascinated by the first 20, 30 years of the 20th century. I think that, so therefore it almost was something I had to write, and therefore that helped to accelerate the process. On the reception side, I think the reception was one where a lot of people felt that I was a little bit one-sided. They felt that that was wrong to talk about a never-ending war. That somehow I was just trying to kind of uh, creating a link between different events that were not really legitimate. And I think a lot of people didn't understand and still didn't understand the focus I placed on culture. And that's because in general, people in our world find the cultural conflict very difficult to grasp, and particularly to understand that cultural conflict can be no less lethal than any other conflict. So I think that there were some reactions, and then I had some very positive reactions from people, and continue to get some positive reactions from people where they felt that this was a very important uh, point of departure for their own journey to understand, what was really happening kind of later on. So on balance, I think the reception to it was both critical but also encouraging, and I'm glad that I wrote it. So it was worth writing, if just for the reaction, if nothing else. Although for me, it was just good therapy. Yeah,
It's a wonderful piece of writing I personally can't recommend highly enough. Professor Furedi, thank you so much for your time today.
pleasure.
Frank Furedi's analysis provides a framework for understanding how the legacy of the First World War continues to influence our modern Western societies. This terrible, nightmarish war has undermined faith in both Enlightenment ideas and liberal democracy, and then led to the rise of radical ideologies in its wake. Post-war society experienced a profound shift from ideological to cultural conflict, centered on disputes over lifestyle and identity, which we can see dialed up all the way up to 11 all over the Western world today. World War I didn't just kill millions of people, it killed something bigger, something contemporary societies are struggling to fully comprehend. It killed an era and maybe even a substantial part of our collective consciousness at that time, and we are still trying to figure out what replaced it. As always, all the key links in the show notes. Please make sure you take a good look at Frank Furedi's First World War, Still No End in Sight. It's a relatively short book, but my guess is that you will learn a lot from it. Thank you very much for your attention today, and see you next time.